when you're looking at different access points, parking lots, 2 tracks, ways into that piece, maybe it's a waterway, what are you looking at for your advantage? And then also, how does that play into the kind of pressure scenario?
My experience hunting public land, this is turkeys, this is whitetails. There's like almost layers to this stuff. And you hear about this on studies that research agencies have done on like how far people go in. And they're like, if you get like 3/4 of a mile in, you left everybody behind. When I've hunted Iowa, there's 2 things going on there. A lot of good deer, and the people don't have to work generally that hard to get on them. And so when you're looking at public land down there, it looks generally really nice. Like there'll be fields on it, nice deciduous forests, depending on where you're at, of course. And so that first layer, maybe say the first 1/4 of a mile or something, 1/3 of a mile, there's going to be an awful lot of places that look really good to people, and they're going to sit them. You can almost, in my experience, go on your Onyx, look at Iowa public land and be like, there's probably going to be a stand there in that field corner. There's probably going to be a stand right off of this trail going in, and you go in and you see those stands pretty often. So what I've found is the next layer back is usually where I start getting interested in stuff. The pressure's going to be concentrated closer to those access points. It just is, and closer to the 2 tracks going through there. And now you're like, where are these islands of cover that aren't just right there? And they're typically just another layer in.
Lights,
camera,
follow the trail.
Ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least 1 previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio from the guys at Exodus.
Welcome back to another episode of Trail Cam Radio. I am Chad, and today we have a a public icon, a national icon in the hunting community, second-time offender, and that is Tony Peterson. Tony, how the hell are you, man?
I'm doing great, buddy. I'm glad to be back, and I'm doing just fine, man.
Good to hear. So getting amped up for the turkey woods as we were just kind of chatting pre-record. What do you have in the playbook there?
Man, my goal is to get my little girls, my twin 10-year-old daughters, birds in Minnesota and birds in Wisconsin. And it's going to be a heavy lift judging by the long-term forecast, because the forecast sucks. But I've been scouting birds pretty hard, and we'll be around them. So, as long as it doesn't get too cold or rainy, or, the weather doesn't really shut everything down, it'll be good regardless. But, you know how it is when you're coming into turkey season, you're like, please just give me like 60-degree days with tons of sun so we can call them and work them. And we're not going to get that right away. It doesn't look like.
Is this, do they have a couple seasons under their belt, or is this first time go around?
So they started when they were 8, and they both got birds, which was really cool. And then last year, one of my daughters got one, and the other one she had bad luck. The farm that we were hunting on, there were 4 jakes on there, and I called those birds in like 6 different times, and they had no visible beards. And so, you'd see them coming, and you're like, here they come. And, right into the decoys, like, you can't green light her. And the toms that we were working, they're hunting with a 410. It's close range type stuff. And we just never had the good opportunity on the second bird. And so now going from that, 1 bird spring to a 4 bird spring it's going to be a lot. But, this is going to sound so stupid, but I put in a lot of time scouting turkeys for them. And I feel pretty confident we're going to be around them.
That's awesome, man. It's going to be exciting to kind of follow along and see what happens there. That's cool.
Dude, it's so fun. I can't wait for that opener.
My son just turned 6 a couple days ago, and my daughter will be 7 in July. And I only hunt turkeys running gun. Like, I've never sat in a ground blind, or maybe once or twice, never killed anything from a ground blind. And we don't have a lot of private ground access to like kind of cater a hunt towards them, or for them. And they want to go so bad. And I'm just like, I just don't think they're quite ready yet. I know, they can't sit still. They can't be quiet. And I want to give them like a first time experience that's, that gets them excited, let them hear a couple birds. So I think I'm kind of teeter-tottering back and forth whether to take them or not. If I do take them, I think it will be, go out roost the birds the night before, and then just take them out early in the morning, let them hear them talk on the roost. And then whatever happens after that just happens after that. We'll call it a day or whatever. So,
man, that age is tough. That's pretty young.
Yeah.
And, when I when I took my girls when they were 8, first off, I wouldn't have done it if they hadn't legalized 410s here, because it was just that's what they could handle. And that's like such a good option for them. But trying to get them in any scenario where you're not in a blind, so tough.
Yeah.
They're just, they're just not used to it. And it's they're gonna get busted. And so it's a weird style of hunting for me too. Like when you got a shotgun, like getting into a blind is weird. It's not my thing.
Yeah.
But for them, if you can get a place where you can get them scouted out and know that you'll be around birds and probably see some and hear them, it's so different. I mean, it's so nice, and I'm pretty lucky here. We're going to lose it this year, but the farm that we're hunting, which is going to be under development by the end of the year, it's so close to my house. I can scout it. There's one of those like generational roosts. So, you always know you're going to hear a ton of gobbling. Even if they fly down, they go somewhere else. It's pretty exciting, like you can kind of count on it. And then if I can pick them up after school, those birds are coming back there. And so You're like, you always can be around them, whether they're that callable or, sometimes not even that visible. At least in that situation, you're like, you're going to hear them. You're going to have something that's going to talk back a little bit to you. And that makes such a difference.
Absolutely. Well, we love turkey hunting, but that's not the reason we got you on the show, man. I want to talk to you about digital scouting and what you prioritize. We've done some content here at the office. Actually, we did that this morning. It's not yet released, but what we prioritize digital scouting when going into new pieces. So as a non-resident, you're going into a new state. Obviously, opportunities to have boots on the ground are limited. So really start with digital scouting to get boots on the ground. But I also want to talk about how you personally use digital scouting around, your home farms or stuff in your backyard. Before we get into that, I will give a 5-minute recap on your 2021 season, man, because it was a hell of a one.
2021 was weird, dude. So that was my first real go being with MeatEater in a, almost a full-time capacity. I am full-time with them now, but that was my first kind of like, okay, this is, you're doing stuff for MeatEater. And so, I honestly, back to my daughters, because I had to save a couple of my tags for 1 week in November, tags that I usually hunt a lot on, Minnesota and Wisconsin, I had to save those. And so I'm like, okay, I took my daughters over to Wisconsin. We hunted a lot and they got their first deer and that was awesome. So I kind of lived vicariously through them, spent a little time out in North Dakota in a spot I love and killed a mule deer. And that kind of got my fix a little bit. And then, came back and started 1 week in November and just had a really quick hunt, go off in Minnesota. I've got a really good buddy down there. Eric is his name. And we do a lot of stuff together. He's a really good hunter and he's just a good friend of mine. And so we work on a couple properties together and just hang stands and strategize. And, we had hung that stand and a couple other ones in August, knowing, kind of like, all right, this is going to be a rut deal. Like, let's get where they're going to be running. And it just worked out real fast. The first deer that came through that wasn't getting chased by coyotes was a really big 8-pointer, came in just like
Giant.
he was supposed to. Yeah. It's so funny. I got that buck back. I got a Euro mount of him and his body was so big that he kind of just was a proportional looking deer. You know what I mean? Like when on film, you look at him and you're like, that's a nice buck. You get him in your hands and he's a monster. Like people, they see him and they're like, there's no way that deer broke 150. Then you hold him and you're like, there's no question that deer breaks 150. It was just a gift, right? Like just such a gift. And then I got to go to Wisconsin and have some amazing encounters and killed a nice buck there. And it was so it was a weird, very condensed season for me, because my own hunting was only really like maybe 11, 12 days. I mean, I did a little late season stuff and killed some does, but I spent more time with my little girls trying to get them deer in Wisconsin than anything. So it was a very efficient season. Let me put it that way.
Efficient's a good word, man.
Yeah.
Efficient's
there wasn't a lot of wasted time, man.
I watched that first episode of 1 week of November or whatever the MeatEater, your Wired to Hunt deal was. And I watched that first hunt and I was like, oh my gosh, is that a freaking giant ape? That was cool, man. You could see your enthusiasm, like genuine excitement for that hunt. Like as that played out, that was cool to see.
Yeah, it was, I got yelled at by some people for saying the F word, for being the first guy to drop an F-bomb on camera, like 12 minutes into the show. But it was honestly, you know how it is. I mean, we were sitting there and it was not a great day out. It was cold, it was windy. We were kind of up on this ridge and I had planned pretty well for it, but it was cold. And I was sitting there and I'm like, we went in with the intention to sit all day and I'm like, I don't want to ask my cameraman to do that
Sure.
if he's not comfortable with it cuz it was going to be tough for me and I could tell it was going to be a real issue probably. So you're sitting there and you're like, how long do we ride this out? Like how's this going to play out? And one of the first things that happened was a couple coyotes chased a little buck through, and they went right down the trail that big buck came down on. And so you're sitting there and you go, okay, now I don't, the clock's ticking on how long we're going to actually make it. And then you just had a couple coyotes go through and clearly bust a buck out. And so you're just like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know if this is going to be my morning. And all of a sudden, you hear, it was a corn stalk that snapped as he was running through it. And you look up, and here he's coming, barreling in at like 40 yards. And I mean, it's the whole encounter was like 5 seconds. Like I know it looks crazy, and like the editors hate it because there's no pre-roll or anything.
Yeah.
But that's literally what happened. I went from thinking, man, we're gonna maybe have to call this sit early, and I didn't want to because I knew it was a good spot. To I heard him crash. Like it was crazy.
Yeah, man. That's one of those typical rut scenarios. You never know what's around the next tree or the next corner. And that's what we sometimes have to tell ourselves to kind of grind it out, when we get in those situations. But thought that was really, really cool, man. Super happy for you and everyone involved. So
Thank you.
just want to give you a big shout out for that. But let's get into the episode. I want to talk to you about digital scouting. And kind of your top 4 or 5 priorities, or it could be 3, could be 6, whatever, but your top priorities, when you're going into a new state. I mean, there's really, you've kind of seen the gamut. I'm not going to say that you haven't seen any habitat that, that is new to you. I mean, you hunted swamps, ag, big woods, prairie. I mean, kind of seen it all, but going into a new state, new area, like where are you starting at? Whether you're using Onyx, Google Maps, the tool doesn't really necessarily matter, but just that priority list of what you're actually looking for to get started.
There's a couple things that you just got to think about. I use Onyx, but there are a bunch of good services out there. But I go, okay, let's say I'm going to like Oklahoma as an example, right? And I'm going to go their openers like October 1. So I'm going to go the first week. And so, you got to filter all that stuff in, right? So like if you were going on a rut hunt in Illinois, it'd be a different deal, right? And so I just look at it and I go, okay, what interests me on October 1 on deer down there? And I know it's going to be pretty hot, so I'm going to be looking at water. I know I'm going to be probably thinking about food sources. So I'm going to be like, okay, I want to know where this important stuff is. And then you start thinking, okay, it's going to be opener, so there's going to be people all over. So where are the 2 tracks? Where's the access? Can I find a patch of like checkerboard public land where I might be able to, I might be working with a smaller chunk of public, but if I'm parked there, maybe other people will go down the road to the next one. Or am I dealing with a 50,000 acre national grassland or national forest? Like you start just kind of like all that input, all that data, like what does this mean to me? And then I just go through and I start dropping waypoints. I'm like, here's a pond. I might sit that, right? Like here's a creek and I can see that it kind of bends here and it looks shallow. There's probably a crossing there. Here's a big block of timber that's public, and next to it's some kind of irrigated field or something. Like, okay, they're gonna feed there. And I go nuts, right? Like I spend sometimes like weeks just dropping pins. Like I did this when I drew Iowa last time, where I'm just like, I want everything that's gonna matter to me. Like where I'm like, maybe that spot, maybe that spot, maybe that spot. And then, I kind of just like let that settle for a while. And I come back around and I go, okay, what really is going to matter? Like, what do I really like? And so you start diving in and you look at every waypoint and go, okay, this one is on a pond I like. Like there's cover around it. I think I can access it here. If the wind probably going to be out of the south or maybe the west that time, and it looks like there's nice cover on this side to sit. And if it's like starts checking those boxes, like I'm going to keep that one. But if I go through there and I'm like, you know what, this is kind of like more in the open probably, and like more of an open pasture pond, or there's no good cover around it, or I don't like how this 2 track goes right through there, I'll get rid of that one. It's done. I don't care about it anymore. And so I sort of just go through that process. Like if you were going, you drew that Iowa tag and you're going down there and you're like, I'm rut hunting big Iowa bucks. Like the process would be kind of the same, but you'd be like, okay, north or a west wind, right? And you'd be like, instead of water being super important to me or food sources being super important, I want those pinch points in those funnels. Like, where's that bottleneck of timber, or where's that, like, you throw on that hybrid layer so you can see the topo lines and go, man, it pinches down on this ridge right here. But what you're looking at is like all these spots that you kind of just like, like I always say this, like when you're fishing, hook sets are free, right? Like when you're bass fishing and you think you got a bite, set the hook, because who cares? Like if you get it wrong, doesn't matter. And if you get it right, then you got to fish, and that's awesome. Waypoints are free. Just freaking drop them. And then once you get to a certain point, you go, okay, I know I overdid it because I have 47 of them in 3 properties, and I just start calling them. Okay, this one only has one thing going for it, or I just don't like it for whatever reason, it's gone. Pretty soon you start just like getting this clearer picture of like this area, and this area. And that's when I start to feel really good about my travel.
There was a lot in that. Let me take a step back and add some context around the hunt, because I think that's one of the first things that you mentioned was really to wrap parameters on around the hunt, the time frame, what your expectations are, expectations of maybe outside pressure, whether it's early season, mid-season, rut, late season. So, because as you mentioned, different times of the year, you specifically are going to hold different things in priority. So let's back up and put some context around this, because I think most people generally listening to this, I know you're an early season guy and you like to hit these spots early season and even into October where there's not as much pressure. But I think, again, generally overall, at least for our audience, most people are taking their rutcation or their 1 week in November, maybe the latter part of October, and squeaking into those first few days of November. So let's use that in context. This is a traveling rut hunt into, let's use Iowa, for example. I mean,
sure.
Iowa's it, right?
Like an easy one.
You're waiting 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years to draw that tag. And it's a big deal. And like, this is where guys are putting in work to make sure they do have success. So with that, Iowa's obviously a limited draw state. How high do you rank? I'm going to say this. I'm going to say access for you, and also other pressure. So when you're looking at different access points, parking lots, 2 tracks, ways into that piece, maybe it's a waterway. What are you looking at for your advantage? And then also, how does that play into the kind of pressure scenario?
I was actually a pretty good example for that, at least in my experience, because one of the other things you have to factor into it is Iowa obviously has really great hunting. You don't have to be that good down there to encounter good bucks. Like, you just really don't. And so when my experience hunting public land, this is turkeys, this is whitetails, pheasants. Like, I've spent a lot of time in Iowa. There's like almost layers to this stuff, and you hear about this on studies that research agencies have done on like how far people go in. Like if you get, I know they did this one, I think they did it in Pennsylvania one time. They're like, if you get like 3/4 of a mile in, you left everybody behind, basically. Well, when I've hunted Iowa, there's 2 things going on there. It's a lot of good deer, and the people don't have to work generally that hard to get on them. And so when you're looking at public land down there, it looks generally really nice. Like, there'll be fields on it, nice deciduous forests, depending on where you're at, of course. And so that first layer, maybe say the first 1/4 of a mile or something, 1/3 of a mile, there's going to be an awful lot of places that look really good to people, and they're going to sit them. Like, it's just it. So you can almost, in my experience, go on your Onyx, look at Iowa public land and be like, there's probably going to be a stand there in that field corner. There's probably going to be a stand right off of this trail going in. And you go in and you see those stands pretty often. And so what I've found is the next layer back is usually where I start getting interested in stuff. And so it's really a matter of, you understand the pressure is going to be there. And this happens in a lot of states. The pressure is going to be concentrated closer to those access points. It just is, and closer to the two tracks going through there. And now you're like, where are these islands of cover that aren't just right there? And they're typically just another layer in. And so you just go, I'm probably just going to walk by where a lot of people would hunt to find a concentration that's reacting to where a lot of people would hunt. And so that's what I would do with Iowa. I would go into it with the idea that I'm probably not going to find a gimme spot like close, super close. And Western hunters would laugh at this, but it'd be like, instead of hunting 400 yards from the road, I'm going to start 800 yards from the road, like a half a mile, which is a joke, if you go out west, but right. In the whitetail world can be a big deal. And then the other thing I would say is that, anybody who's listening is like, I couldn't justify an October trip or a September trip. I got to go when it's going to be the rut. I would just say, give yourself enough time, because what you're saying is, I'm gonna bank on the deer giving me an edge, but everybody's gonna bank on the deer giving you an edge. So you might literally have 5 or 10 times the pressure in the woods with you. And I've seen this, and I've killed bucks in those scenarios in Nebraska in some states, and it's like a legitimate concern. It's the same thing with a velvet hunt in a lot of places. Everybody wants to go get a velvet buck. Well, everybody wants to go get a velvet buck, and it's crazy. But if you go off time, so I'd say don't, if you're married to the rut idea, that's fine. You got to do some research on that second, third layer in there. And then you got to go, this might not be a 4-day hunt. This is going to be, I need to give this like 7 all day sits, and you'll get on them, but you'll be working around more pressure.
Yeah. There's a couple of things I want to mention just to kind of back all those statements up. We were recently in Iowa. I should draw an Iowa tag, by the way. So that was kind of a selfish question for Cameron and I both. But we were in Iowa, did not do any digital scouting, but just did some boots on the ground scouting in a few different areas. And we did run into some people sign, not much, but we did run into some people sign. And I think it was probably resident sign. There were some leftover tree stands, et cetera. And most of that was about that quarter-mile mark from the walk-in. And as you got back in that second, third layer, I mean, there's zero sign, and found a lot better deer sign there than we did anywhere else. But so I just want to back that up. One question I have for you on on how you're organizing your Onyx. And this comes from some my Western experience, and then some people I've tried to listen to and take some advice from. One of the things a lot of Western guys will do in regards to elk hunting is they'll draw a circle or block off a distance from kind of all roads. And then they'll do that from every different access point on that piece of public. And then they're left over with a very smaller portion to kind of focus on. Do you do anything similar to that with whitetails on your Onyx?
Yeah. I mean, that strategy, people think this is crazy, but when you hunt a Colorado elk in an over-the-counter unit, I feel when I'm doing that very similar to how I feel when I'm showing up hunting public land whitetails somewhere, because those spots matter. It's there's a difference in scale, obviously, but like, so just as an example, in 2019, I killed a bull in Colorado on like day 7 of a hunt. We'd started out in this area, had some good encounters, whatever, had some people come in, and it just kind of got blown out. Right. So we moved, and we went in just like, okay, we've got an idea of a few places like that you're talking about, where you're like, there's no easy access to this black timber, no easy access to this. And we put on a crazy day. Never heard an elk, never saw an elk. When it got dark, we were 6.5 miles from camp, and it was, it was like a 2-hour hike back out. And it was, it was one of those days that like you actually do feel like you got your ass handed to you elk hunting. And we started looking and going like, what did we miss? Like, where are these spots that, just like you're talking about, like people aren't going to go, or they're going to it's easier to hike around than drop into it. And we found a spot like that. And as soon as we walked in, it was like, this is over. Like, you looked around, you're like, there's elk here right now. And we set up, called in a bull like almost instantly. And I shot him and he tipped over and we called in another bull and almost killed him. My buddy almost killed him and he was much bigger. And it was just, that was just where they were. You know, this was toward the end of the season and they knew where people were going and they were just concentrated in that spot. Dude, public land whitetails are the same way. So even this, I'm glad you brought that up because like we always talk about like finding that the tree, right? Like or the crossing or whatever, like getting on, you know, your onX or whatever and being like, I'm going right to that tree and I'm going to set up because it's right on, you know, X, Y, and Z. But a lot of times it is just about areas. And you're like, okay, I know people are going to park here and they're going to walk in. They're going to kind of spread out from this spot. And I know on the other end of the property, they're going to park there and they're going to spread out. So where are the places they're least likely to go? Like where's the cattail slough that's going to keep some people back? Or where's the river they got to cross? Where's the hill they got to climb? Where's just the farther away stuff sometimes? And honestly, it's not, you know, like we've talked about this a lot with like, you know, getting 7 miles deep in the backcountry or whatever to find elk. It's not that anymore. It's just these pockets, and the whitetails are the same way. So sometimes, like, you know, people always bring up that kind of like cliched, like, oh, the right by the parking area thing, but that happens. And so, you know, like when you're talking about, you know, finding these areas and you're like, okay, I'm going to go into this one. I'm going to ground truth it. I'm going to look at it and just see. I always tell people, I'm like, really pay attention to what you see between point A and B. Because you know, like everything you're doing is valuable there. You know, like it's the same thing, like, you know, e-scouting is a tool, just like trail cameras are a tool. Like they're giving you so much intel. But once you get in there and you look at it, and once you get in there, observe and see that sign, now you start putting together like real valuable information.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about, you know, when you're going in and dropping pins while you're digital scouting, I think sometimes it's easy to get romantic or be emotionally attached to a certain pin or a certain area. And you have that in the back of your mind as a destination, right? Like I'm going to, like, for example, this in hill country, I'm going to this saddle. I'm walking to this saddle. I think there's going to be sign there. I'm going to start there. And you get that mentality of point A to point B and not paying attention to what the hell you're seeing, whether you're cutting tracks or there's scrapes or whatever the case is, may lead you in a totally different path. But in your mind, you're thinking, okay, well, I have an hour breaking down this map. These are my points. Like I have to go here. It's a big mistake I think a lot of people make.
Yeah, well, they do. And we do fall in love with spots and we fall in love with ideas. And that's okay to, you know, if they're really good ideas, but a lot of times we get it wrong. And a lot of times when you're going in there to ground truth that stuff, you just find something that puts you in a different direction. And it's that, you know, everybody's going to make that mistake, right? Like everybody's going to walk through that smoking sign because they have a better idea where that stuff's going to be. And, you know, it's going to burn you at some point. Like you figure that out. And once you do, like when that one stings and you go, okay, I'm not doing that anymore. Like I'm going to have a plan. But if the deer show me something I should be paying attention to, I'm going to pivot in a heartbeat and figure that out.
Got it. Okay. So next question, I'm going to give you 3, 4, 5 or 6 different items. And I want you to basically tell me what your top priority is. And we're going to do this around the season. So for example, I'm going to ask you early season in Nebraska, what is your top priority? Digital scouting? Is it water? Is it food? Is it diversity? Is it edge? Is it cover? And then we'll pick a different state, do mid-October, you know, we'll do the October lull per se, and then we'll go rut and then late season. Sound good?
Sure.
So we'll go back to that example. You're heading to Nebraska, early season. You're doing your homework now, digital scouting. What is the very first thing you're looking for? Is it access? Is it food? Is it water? Is it, you know, diversity of habitat? Is it a hard edge? Is it cover? What is it?
Water. September 1, man. And I'll tell you this, I say that with an asterisk on it because it's water unless the week before there's tons of rain. And then it becomes food real quick. And I say that because if you're going to ask me about public land, I'm always thinking competition. So that's like a constant with me. Like I know I'm going to do whatever other input there is, whether it's food or water, saddles or bedding or whatever. Yeah. I'm always thinking like, how is that in relation to pressure? You know, so that Nebraska example, you know, I've been down there quite a bit early And some years, when it's 100 degrees, you're like, this is an absolute no brainer because it's water. But some years when you get there, you're like, there's water everywhere. And so what's the next thing? And in all of that is always like, where's the pressure and who's walking in here? But, early season's pretty cut and dry, man.
Yeah. When you're talking water, is there any added value when you're looking at ponds versus creeks versus a river? What have you seen there in the early season?
Uh, I like water in the cover. So I
Close to
like,
bedding.
well, just close to where deer feel safe. So yeah, I mean, in a lot of areas of Nebraska and states like that, you're almost guaranteed if you have a creek bottom to have good bedding cover, good browse, just security. And the same thing goes for ponds. You'll find a cattle tank somewhere that, it just doesn't have it. Right. There might be deer tracks around there. There might be rubbed up cedars or something around it, but you're just looking at it going, to get here, they got to walk through 400 yards of open terrain, and they might do it, but I'd rather find the little stock tank or the pond that's in, the wooded draw. And, like that stuff's pretty simple. Right. But then, with the creek bottom river system thing, that's always going to catch my attention. Like, I don't care what time of the season you're talking about. If there's a river or a stream or something on public land, I'm always interested in that because there's always deer around it. There's probably going to be some kind of good crossing somewhere because there's going to be banks or something that funnels them. And, so it just depends what you're looking at.
Okay. So same question, same overall scenario, but it's rained for 2 weeks straight. There's water everywhere. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to go in and find, ag fields on the corner or on adjacent private ground, or maybe there's food plots. Let's skip over the kind of the obvious stuff. Trying to find food sources from an aerial map that relates to security. Do you have any advice? Do you have any tips? What's kind of your strategy there?
A couple things I would think about there, if we just stick with the Nebraska example, if there's tons of rain, there's standing water and all the two tracks and everything, and those deer don't have to work to find. You have two things going on there. There's probably going to be a major mosquito hatch. Like, there's probably going to be a prevalence of mosquitoes that's going to be nasty. And this happens in a lot of states, down south, you deal with this a lot too. And so I'll start thinking, okay, where's the food? Because at least I know where they're going to end up at night, where they're going to start in the morning. If there's some food around, private, public, whatever. But where I start looking now, like, where can they bed or feed where they can catch some wind and get away from those bugs a little bit? And because that's going to be a factor. And it, like when you walk into the woods in the right situation and the mosquitoes have just hatched out and there's a billion of them on you, they're reacting to that too. And so sometimes you'll find them bedded in the middle of a soybean field or something, or up on a hill where you're like, why? Like there isn't hardly any cover there, just a little bit, but they're so good at blending in. And so you'd look at, like on X and be like, okay, well, here's the woods. That's where they should be bedding. But when you walk into the woods, if you're miserable from the mosquitoes, they're probably not bedding there. You know what I mean? So you got to kind of factor that stuff in. So it's always like, everybody's always looking for like, what food source right now? And it's like, well, maybe, if you have an isolated bean field, okay, pick that one, but there's all these other things going on out there that they're really in tune to. So we try to kind of distill it down, but you got to think like, what's everything that's going on right now?
Yeah, that's a good answer, man. That's something that I don't think about. That's not until you get in that situation, I guess.
So the reason that I say that is because the last time I hunted the Nebraska opener, that very scenario happened. I had ponds pinned everywhere. And then we drove down there and they got a bunch of rain. The mosquitoes were ruthless. And when I started glassing, I started seeing bucks bedding right in the middle of a soybean field on a walk-in ranch. And I'm going, they're there because they can stand up, feed, they can lay down, and there was wind sucking right down through this valley. And it was like just a little microclimate they found where they've got their food. Nothing's going to sneak up on them out there. And the mosquitoes were kept at bay. And it was just like we killed 2 velvet bucks in there and got out. It was amazing. But it just taught me like that kind of stuff really factors into your hunt if you're aware of it.
Yeah. Before we go on to the next question, that just sparked a kind of a thought in my mind. Do you think as whitetail hunters, we put too much effort into digital scouting, and in those scenarios, do you think you're better off just sometimes just showing up, seeing what you have for playing cards, and play the hand that's dealt?
I think if you have that mentality, like I don't think I think there is an issue of overanalyzing. Like I think you can just overdo it, right? Because it isn't an exact science. Like you could look at a property for 1,000 days on Onyx and just miss a ton of stuff just by the nature of the beast, right? So I think it's good to like give yourself a real understanding of the land, but go in with the idea that even if you did put 100 hours of e-scouting in, you probably got most of it wrong, or most of it is just not quite what you need to really make the in the moment decision and get in there. Like, I mean, if you said, you can e-scout as much as you want, but you don't get to ground truth anything, you got to go right to your spots when you show up, or you said, we're going to give you a full day to go in and look around, I don't know which one I'd pick, because they're both so valuable. And the e-scouting really doesn't matter until you get there.
Right.
So like that part, you can't deny how important it is, just getting in there and going, okay, what really is going on here?
Yeah, that's kind of when we recorded the content earlier today, that's kind of the approach that we took, was like, this is a general starting point to get you going, to get you have some type of direction, some type of game plan. That's game plan A, game plan B, game plan C, game plan D. All that could change with what you're seeing on the ground. So I think being open to change, being flexible, not having some type of plan set in stone, exactly what you're saying, is kind of the key to that, to not become too attached to your digital scouting.
Yeah. And I mean, it really, it's just it's a dance, man. Like sometimes you see stuff through e-scouting where you're like, I'm going there for the rut, and these 2 blocks of timber that pass through this little chunk of public, like somebody's going to go through there in the next 4 days, and I'm going to ride it out. And even then, like when you have a lot of conviction, you got to just be open to the fact that if you get there and you start observing, or you see that sign, like we're talking bow hunting, right? Like if you're off by 100 yards, you're off by a mile. Like,
Right.
so and you get that wrong sometimes. But if you're just like, this is it, all right, go into it and go, that's my area, but I'm not going to settle until I am on that X. And that's not going to be from e-scouting anymore. That's going to be from the sign and what the deer show you.
Yep. Absolutely. So same type of question, different scenario. It's mid-October. We'll call it the quote unquote October lull. And you are headed to, I don't know, think of a state. You're headed to Kentucky. And you're going to be in the Daniel Boone National Forest. So big woods, in hill country, some steep topography. You're doing your digital scouting. What are you looking for? Is it water? Is it food, diversity, edge, cover? What's the very first thing that you're dropping a pin on if you're headed to the Boone in mid-October?
Well, when you're talking a big wood scenario like that, a lot of hills, I would probably start right off the bat with access first. Because if everything, you kind of got that mono habitat. Like I run into this in northern Wisconsin a lot. When you scroll over that with like on Onyx, like it's a much heavier lift than a lot of ag country and western stuff, because you're like, everything looks the same. So then you're like, okay, well, where do I start? And now, do I have 2 square miles, or do I have 20? Like how do I divide this down into something that's like, okay, I'm just gonna take these 2 sections and I'm gonna start here. And so it's like, well, how do I get in right here? Here's how everybody gets in. So what's within that couple sections that's going to start to get my interest? And if you're talking October down there, again, you're talking water. If you can find some surface water in there, or a creek or something, it's like, okay, now I've got something to start with, because you might be dealing with hard mass down there. Like you might have a real scattered, not super dense deer population. And so you're like, okay, water would concentrate them if I can find it. And if not, it's like, okay, well, maybe I just got to pick this access point, and I like this hillside because it's real benchy, or I like this big valley because it looks like it has maybe like some soft edges in there, or like maybe where some browse meets the hardwoods or something. And then you're going to go, my e-scouting isn't as valuable in this kind of scenario. So I got starting points here, here, and here. And when I get there, I'm going in and I'm looking, because that's like an in the moment thing. And, if you find that acorn pattern or whatever, it's like, okay, if this is hopping, it's over. Now we know what to do. Or because it's mid-October, you start getting in there and you're like, I'm not finding this sign of mass, but I'm finding big scrapes there. Like I can smell them, and I'm starting to see these cluster rubs, and I'm going, okay, even though all this land looks the same, there's a reason this sign is here. And just like, that makes it sound really easy. Like you could do that and walk into 5 spots and not see any sign, but that's, like you're eliminating dead water, like they say when you're fishing. Like, okay, this spot, no good. And you start to run patterns too in that stuff, because that big woods hunting is hard.
It's tough.
It just is a different thing.
Yep.
And so whatever those deer give you for fresh sign or any sightings or whatever you jump them, all of that stuff is like, okay, where's the pattern? Like why was he bedded there? Or why are those rubs there? Or why is there this just one community looking scrape here in the bottom of this valley? Like, where are they coming from? Like, why communication hub here? And you start asking yourself that and like going, okay, now I can go back to my e-scouting and look at the next 2 sections over and say, the top of this ridge that had this exposure had awesome browse on it, and they were bedded there. And you look and you're like, there's another one a mile away. Then you start getting into something. But we're making it sound easy. Like it can be a frustrating mess, man.
Yeah, that whole scenario, mid-October, big woods, low deer density, it is not a freaking easy task to break down. Whether you're e-scouting with boots on the ground, it is difficult. 99% of the time you're gonna fail. And I think going into that, you just gotta have that be able to accept that failure and have the mentality like you just have to keep going. But I think the one really, really valuable point that you mentioned is being able to have some type of sign, encounter, sighting, some type of tip that there's deer in a certain area, whether they're using a certain type of habitat or certain terrain feature, and then being able to replicate that in other areas on your map. Like, dude, I think that is so freaking valuable. And there's times that I've done it myself where something happens, I bump a buck or I have an encounter and I totally screwed up, right? And I get so excited and fixated on chasing maybe that one specific deer. We do a lot of that crazy stuff here. And I forget about, okay, well, maybe I can look at my map at 2 ridges over. Maybe it's only a few hundred acres from where I had that encounter. And there's a replication of that specific terrain feature. Maybe it's a thermal hub. There's a thermal hub here, another one 3 ridges over. A lot of times I don't, then that passes, not just go over there and check it out, see what's there.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a really good point there too, about, hunting deer versus hunting big bucks. Like find where deer concentrations are. Like, man, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make, and you make this on your home farm, you make this when you travel 7 states over and go hunt, is you go in and you're like, where do the 150 inchers live? And it's like, like now you're sprinting and you don't know how to crawl yet. Like go find, and this is like if you talk Iowa versus, Kentucky big woods or, northern Wisconsin big woods. If you go into Iowa, you're going to find a deer concentration everywhere. If there's timber, there's going to be deer, right? So then you can go, okay, I'm going to start looking for what big bucks are going to leave for me. But a lot of places with lower deer density and not that kind of cut and dried bed to food to bed type of terrain, just finding where deer are, just like the elk, it's such a good starting point. And people, like they kind of forget, or, this is probably a problem that like guys like me in the hunting industry have created, where like, it's like, you got to go find where that big one in the section or the mature bucks live. And in my experience, they're with the other deer. Like they just lit, like there's a reason those does are raising their fawns in this spot and they're feeding here and they're bedding there. There's a reason that little 2.5-year-old walked through there. There's a reason those deer are in those spots. And so if you could start to just get on deer, especially on public land, you will get on big ones, or you'll get on deer that are good enough for you.
Yep. Two things there. One, when we kind of did our content earlier this morning, diversity was kind of like one of the number one priorities, just looking at a general piece saying there would be whitetails there. Like that is the starting point. Just find deer, number one, right? And then to kind of back that up, I'm going to just mention or replay the Kansas hunt that I had with Clint this past fall. Shot a Boone and Crockett deer on a piece of weehaw, right? Like not expecting to do that, like 1 in a million. It'll probably never happen again. But I saw 7 or 8 different deer before I had that encounter with a giant, and none of them were over 125 inches. Those are does, those are young bucks, 2-year-olds. All of that kind of interaction happened basically, I don't know, 2 days before I had an encounter with that bigger deer. Now we saw a bigger sign that was there, so you had some telling sign that there was something big. But you just never know. But the point that just go get in deer, I think is it. Like that. If no one takes anything else away from that, just e-scout, just to get yourself in a position to be in deer, I think that's a success.
Well, and people will say, okay, well, that's Kansas, right? Like you're going to run into a booner. Like, no, that's a pretty special thing. Like Kansas, no Kansas, I don't care. That's a pretty amazing thing. But the lesson is, and this is one of the things I love about seeing like the public land movement and seeing the hunting public guys out there and stuff, is like people all over the country are seeing that there's quality deer in places that they would have swore they're not. And so when you think like on your, just like kind of what you said there, I don't care where you go. Like, I don't care what state you live in. I don't care how much pressure you have around your house, how horrible you think your state is. If you have a decent enough chunk of land, there's bucks that go through there that are going to make almost every bow hunter happy. Yes. And we always think like, no, I got to get to this state or this place or this time frame to encounter them. I'm like, they're out there. They're all over. And we're not talking 200-inch bucks here. We're just talking like awesome 120, 130-inch deer. Like they live out there in a lot of these places, and people don't think so.
What about in some of those prairie states where you have, a lot of CRP, a lot of grasses, a lot of giant ag? Is there anything specific you're looking there on digital scouting? I know a lot of guys look at creek bottoms and, try to find some timber. And I think that stuff is kind of obvious. And I also think because it is so obvious, that it attracts most of the non-resident or the hunting pressure. Typically, at least that's what I've seen from my experience. Is there anything kind of outside the box that you're looking at in kind of Oklahoma, Texas, anywhere where there's a lot of prairie type habitat?
Connection. So like connecting cover, right? Like when you have there are barriers, at least daylight barriers to deer. Interstates, big rivers, the obvious stuff. But there's also just like real open ground is a barrier. Now, like, and that might be like pastured, something like that. It might be some kind of grassland where they're just not, most of the year not going to just light out across there. But there's always some kind of connection, a fence line or some drainage ditch, or like a cattail slough. There's something like they're figuring out. It might just be like a little bit of a hill, like a little bit of something that gets them a little lower, because they don't like being watched. And one of the things that I'm just like starting to focus on, like with my winter scouting and some of the places I go to, is just like, how do these properties connect to each other, and how can the deer get there without getting spotted from people on the roads? And so we started running into this. I love pheasant hunting with my dogs, and I do a lot of open ground, grassland type pheasant hunts. And it's all public land, and the amount of bucks I jump and the amount of deer trails I see that are just using such subtle little folds in the terrain. Like if you looked at it on onX, you'd say there's nothing there. Like it might not even register as a 10-foot difference in the topo lines. But when you get out there, you look at it and go, there's like just a little bit of difference. And often there's a little bit of difference in vegetation in those spots. And you go out there and you're following a dog around trying to kick up a rooster, and you're like, I'm on a pounded deer trail. and I can't see the gravel roads here, even though this ground is real flat. And they are doing that stuff all the time, so the challenge there is like, is there a place to ambush them where I can hide? And,
Right.
sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But like you said, if you're in a place with limited cover, people are going to go to that cover. But then you got to rethink, well, what is good cover now? And the deer learn it, and they know, get out in the open in some of those spots. And so I just think like all of that stuff, the more time you spend in that kind of habitat and that terrain, the more you just realize how good those deer are at just avoiding us in all of these different environments. And I mean, they're just masters at it. And then most of it is just because we think like kind of narrow inside the box. Just go, well, they got to be by the trees, or they got to be that old homestead or that creek bottom. It's like, yeah, some of them are. Some of them live out here where you don't bother them.
Yeah. So let's again, same scenario, or same type of question, different scenario. We'll bypass the rut. I think we've already talked about that, but this is a late season hunt. You are headed to, let's pick a less obvious state. I think if you pick something like Illinois or something like that, I think it's pretty obvious. Let's do something with a little bit less agriculture, like a state. Well, hell, let's just say Minnesota. I mean, that's kind of your that's kind of your backyard.
Sure.
So,
Let's
what do
pick
you?
the state that has absolutely kicked my ass in the late season my entire life. Sure.
Well, maybe we can all
let's
learn,
do it.
learn
Let's do
something
it.
from your failure. So what, e-scouting, what are you looking for? Very first thing you're looking for in Minnesota public land.
The thickest cover available. So, this would vary because Minnesota is a pretty diverse state. You got a lot of kind of grasslands and cattail sloughs to the west. You got deciduous forests and bluffs southeast, and northeast. You've got real big woods. So it's pretty diverse. But I just know, okay, well, what's the disadvantage you have? It's after a pretty intense gun season, like a lot of us deal with. So 20% of the deer are in the freezer or whatever, and they're not tolerating mistakes. Like they're like, I'm done with your BS. Like you got to be on your A game or you're not going to get me. So there's a downside to that. The upside is everybody has given up. You don't have, there's no bow hunting pressure out there. The gun seasons are over. And so you do just generally have a lot of woods to work with and a lot of land to work with against the deer, and not have to worry about such a high prevalence of other hunters in there. I mean, it'll depend if there's grouse or pheasant hunters or whatever, but you look at that and go, okay, that's a benefit, right? Like, so now what do I do with it? Well, I know they're going to focus on food, but they're not going to risk anything to get there. So I have to go, I've got 10, 11 hours of daylight. That's all I got to work with. And they've got 13 hours at night to feed whatever they've got at that time of year. It's like, okay, I need to get into the cover and I need to figure out where I can catch those deer staging, either, mostly in the evening, but sometimes in the morning when they're coming back, where I can get tucked into some kind of bedding cover, the thickest stuff that's available, and I can get in there in some way to catch them coming or going. I go kind of right back to like my October pattern. A lot of time is just hunt staging areas. They stage real hard in the late season because they do not want to go out in the open and risk anything. And this is ubiquitous across heavy hunted states everywhere. I think like they figure that stuff out. And so now your job is to like really be a ninja, get in there, like not make any noise, be as quiet as you can, play that wind, like do everything right and get into the cover with them.
Yeah, sneaking into that stuff in the late season, man, is it difficult? You don't have any cover to deal with. All the foliage is down. Things are crunchy when the ground is cold. A lot of times you're walking on frozen snow. Is there any tips or advice you could give anybody to kind of help not sound like a freaking human?
Well, this is a really hard thing to do. And this is one of the reasons I like having lots of spots is like, I don't like limiting myself because let's say you get that crunchy snow, which you're gonna get, right? Like in a lot of these states, you're gonna get that. Or if you're a little farther south, you might have frozen leaves that function the same way. And you go, I can't get in here. Like if I go in here, they know it and it's over. And so you tend to be a little more surgical and go, when is it going to be warm enough mid-afternoon that I can get in there and be quiet, take my time? or when is the wind going to just work for me here? Like, so it's not blowing back into the cattails where they're bedded. I mean, you sometimes just got to go like, I'm not hunting this spot until it sets up for me. And that can be maddening because it might be a week or 2 weeks,
Yeah.
or you just might not get it. But if you're trying to get in there on that stuff when it's crunchy, or you're just like going to give yourself away, it's just not worth it. But, if you have enough spots and you're like, okay, the place I want to go to so bad, like I'm going to blow that up and I don't want to. But I got this other spot here where I can probably hop rocks on this creek to get in and just stay low and use the noise of the creek or something. Like if you have other options like that, then you can still hunt. And it might not be your like primo option, but you're still going. And I'm pretty religious about that because when I get time, I'm like, I want to go hunting. But I hate feeling like I'm going in blowing something up. You know what I mean? So like and if you don't have that option and you have the time to hunt and you want to hunt, you can talk yourself into it. And everybody does this.
Absolutely.
But like you want to preserve that spot. Like you don't want to do that. So how do you just work with like your own, like I was just looking at it like it's a character flaw. Like I want to go hunt this so bad. And if I don't give myself enough options to not hunt it, I'm going to go hunt it. And that's going to be bad. And I know it and I'm going to do it anyway. So just like set it up so you got other things to do.
Absolutely. We've been talking the whole episode basically about public ground. Does any of this stuff change for you other than the access points, right? Like when we start talking about private, does anything change other than access? I mean, that's the kind of the obvious one.
Well, yeah, I mean, private, we tend to talk about private like it's always better than public. And I actually, like that late season example, man, a lot of times when you get into certain areas of this country that are real ag heavy, like if it can be plowed, it's going to be plowed. And if it can't, it's going to be left alone. And in that scenario, it might end up in the state's hands or in the Fed's hands where we can all hunt it. And so sometimes the best geothermal cover and the best wintering cover out there is actually public. So there's like a switch, right? Or, sometimes you just have a private piece that gets hunted hard anyway. So you can't totally like just blanket say, don't think about the pressure or whatever. But for me, the one thing that e-scouting on private properties has done, like, properties that only I hunt, like a couple that I own or properties I have permission on, is it just forces me to look at the big picture of whatever property it is and go, you know what? I never go there. I never go there. Like I hunted it 12 years ago and I never saw a deer and I never think about it. I always park here and I walk in this way and I look at this. And so for me, like e-scouting does two things on private land. It really informs my winter scouting, which we're just coming out of. Cause I'm like, I just force myself to go look at everything. Like, what are you missing, dude? Like, where are the rubs you're missing in it? I do that because, where I live, I hunt like 20, 30 acre properties. They're tiny. And I just think like, I got this. Like, I know, like it's 20 acres. I know everything about it. And then after the season, I'll walk through this little patch of willows or something. And I'll be like, he was right here. Like I missed it right here. And so you're just like constantly reminding yourself of the things you get wrong. And e-scouting can just give you that plan. Because you love this spot and you love this area around your food plot and you love walking in on this trail, but all these spots in between that you just write off and go, well, that's a bedding area. I'm not going to touch it. Or that open flat doesn't work. Man, e-scouting can just kind of like frame that up for you. Just give you a reason to go look at them.
Yeah. One thing I would actually add to that, and it relates to kind of the big picture. Most of the time when people are scouting private ground, digital scouting, to your point, they've walked it all. A lot of people are hunting 20s and 30s and 40s. Maybe they have a 60 or maybe they have an 80, which in the areas that we live would be a bigger chunk. Most of the time, folks aren't digital scouting the neighbor piece or the back 100 and seeing what type of habitat is there, what type of terrain features, what could be over there that helps relate the sign on your piece to actual deer movement. I think that's something that's pretty big, pretty important that a lot of people miss on.
Oh man, that's such a good point. That you get reminded of that a lot. And you can't go, most places you can't hop the fence and go look at your neighbor's property,
right.
But you can see what they're doing there and what's going on. And now, I mean, you can see tower blinds and you can see, like, if you hunt down south, you can see feeders. like automatic feeders that have been there a while. You can zoom in and see like fence crossings in some places. I mean, it's incredible, and it just helps you tie in. Like, okay, well, here's an example of that. Just take it a step further. Like a couple weeks ago, I was down in southwestern Wisconsin with a buddy of mine on a property he bought, and I was standing in the corner of his land. We were mostly kind of just shed hunting and messing around, but I had my binos, and I looked down this logging road that goes onto the neighbor's property that we can't go into. And way down there, I could just see like a little glint of something on the side of a tree. So I bring up my binos, and there's this brand new ladder stand on this tree on this logging road that comes out into my buddy's land where he's got a ladder stand. And so I started thinking about it. I'm like, man, I never hunted that stand, but he did quite a bit. And he had really good hunting right away, right at the opener for the first couple weeks. And then it just died. And he had a camera there. And, we were like, well, maybe they're nocturnal, maybe something else, maybe, XYZ reason. And because the daylight movement died. Well, as soon as I saw that stand, I was like, well, man, there was somebody else coming in from the opposite direction. So the place he expected the deer to come from, and he's sitting 100 yards down the trail, has no idea that my buddy's sitting up there playing a totally different wind coming in from a totally different direction. And, they're both absolutely legal and within their rights to do that, but have no concept of how both of you might be screwing the spot up or the accumulated pressure. And you just see that, I saw it through binoculars, but you can see some stuff like that on e-scouting where you're like, this is going to change how I hunt this spot, even though it's somebody else doing their own thing on their own place.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Is there anything else you want to kind of tie into this? I have the kind of three, I'm not going to call them like rapid fire questions because we'll probably allocate a few minutes to each one, but there's three kind of burning questions we want to ask you. But before we do that, is there anything you want to tie in or anything else you want to mention on e-scouting?
I would just say that the most important part of it is do it a lot and then go into the woods a lot and see what you saw or see what, like when you hunt a variety of different terrain and different states, and it doesn't have to be just with whitetails, you could do it with a Western hunt, you could do it with hunting small game or turkeys, but pay attention to what you see on satellite imagery from that 30,000 foot view when you get in there. So you just start to know more, like your buddy Clint, he talks about this all the time, like looking at the mountains in PA and seeing stuff and then going in and looking at it in person. Like, man, you start to build a database of stuff where you go, now when I'm looking at this state I've never been to, and there's this river bottom here, I've seen that movie play out a million times where I can look at the bend like this or the banks or how the bluff butts up against it. And the more you do that stuff, the more you're e-scouting. You just kind of just like close the browser windows, man. You're like, now I'm just like, I got this like focused look at this stuff. And it just helps you be more efficient and pick better spots.
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Okay. So you're in the hot seat.
Okay.
We're going to start with a pretty trending, debatable topic. You guys have talked about on MeatEater. I'm sure you've had discussions. Don't feel influenced because we sell trail cameras. Okay. So you could have any stance on this that you want, but in your opinion, cell cameras, are they ethical? Should they be illegal? Should there be parameters around the time frame you can use them? Like, what are your thoughts?
This is going to be such a weasel word answer.
Oh, come on, Tony.
I think I love them. I have a weird relationship with trail cameras because I don't ever kill deer because I use them, but I love them. Like I never feel like I got this buck dialed and he's going to die because I get pictures of him, but I sure feel like it feeds my decision-making process. The thing I worry about with cell cameras is not, they don't make things that much easier. They sure are fun and addictive, but I worry about what they look like to the non-hunting public. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't catch me sitting here saying like, I want to ban all baiting. Cause like, I don't really care what you're doing. Right. Like if it's legal, I personally don't really care. What I worry about is like, how does this look to the people who might be deciding our fate? That's where cell cameras get like, and some of these issues just get a little wonky with me. Cause I'm like, if they start to be like used in that argument against us. Like these guys are not, they're not hunting. Like they're just using technology and it's unfair. When it starts to get painted in that way, if it becomes a part of that conversation, that's when I get worried. So then, but I wouldn't say like a full on ban. I would say, okay, like maybe outside the season, right? Or maybe, not within 48 hours of when you're going to hunt or something. I don't know. Like I would hate to just like wave a magic wand and get rid of them.
Yeah, it's a growing topic. It's a growing concern on either side of the fence that you sit on. I mean, obviously they have hit social acceptance, critical mass, whatever you want to call it. Everybody are using them. We sell a ton of them. And I think that, when you start looking at fair chase bylaws, and whether you're talking about Pope and Young, Boone and Crockett, obviously, like if you want to enter an animal in the books, like it's now, that's part of their affidavit, fair chase affidavit or whatnot, like you can't have it. When we start looking at some of these other state regs, there's wording put in place to where you can't use electronic devices to pursue or know the whereabouts of a game species. And I think was probably written, and I don't know this, but I'm just assuming, which I know I probably shouldn't do. But at the time that those regulations were first published, you're talking about two-way radios, some type of voice communication, that sort of thing. So when you start thinking about the way the law is written, like a lot of states technically right now, like you can't use them now. Not all states, there's not a whole lot of states that specifically call that out. So it's like this big giant gray area. But I do think, in my opinion, over the next handful of years, I think states are probably going to have to make a clear statute on where they stand, like using cell cameras in season, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, the wording definitely hasn't caught up yet. And I hope there's enough foresight there on these states when this happens, because I think it's going to happen too, where they'll say something like any wireless communication within the last 72 hours or something like that. So then you guys could go, all right, we'll sell you guys a model that doesn't send you pictures for 4 days.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, are you going to argue against that? Like what good does it do me knowing he was here 4 days ago or something? So I hope it just doesn't go, because we tend to like overcorrect a lot of times. And I hope it doesn't go to that, because they are so fun and everybody's using them. And I don't want to see that go away. So I hope that when those conversations become real, like they're getting there, but I hope when it's like, our nuts are on the line, like I hope they go, okay, let's find a compromise that works. So this isn't like just wipe this category out,
Yeah. I think your answer is probably has too much common sense for a lot of states.
Well, yeah, nobody's listening to me anyway.
A lot of state reps to use, but I love it. Okay, on to the next question. How often are you checking your trail cameras throughout the summer? So this is prior to hunting season.
Probably every couple of weeks, maybe. Okay. So this is another thing that I've tried to be way more patient with, is just give them the time to tell me something. You know how it is. Like you first get trail cameras, you want to check them constantly. And I tend to use most of my trail cameras in other states anyway, like over in Wisconsin on some of the private land I have over there. So it's not like I can just go run out quick and check them anyway. But even when I can, I'm like, I want enough information where it's going to work for me. If it's going to do what I need it to do. And I don't run cameras like, I try to really force myself to run cameras in places I'm curious about. Like I try to use them for scouting, like I know a lot of people want to get inventory or whatever, which is fine. But for me, I'm always like, cameras are in question mark spots. Like I just wonder who's going through here, and it doesn't do me any good to go in right away to check them. You know what I mean? Like I need a little bit of a picture, at least a couple weeks or a month or something. So I like to try to let them soak for a while.
Yep, absolutely. I think we kind of fall in the same line. We have a kind of a strategy where we put cameras out usually around Memorial Day, which is early for a lot of people, but because we run a crap ton of cameras, a lot of different states, like you just can't snap your fingers and get them all out in a weekend. So it's kind of a slow, soft launch per se for us. And then that first check comes around the 4th of July for us. So like they're sitting basically for a month. We try to do that. And then after the 4th of July, it's August 18th to like the 21st. The closer we can get to that 21st, 22nd date is kind of it. So for us, there's really only, the way we run cameras, you're looking at 2 checks throughout the summer, unless it's, if you have a mineral site or a salt lick or something like that going on and you just want to get some velvet pictures. But yeah. Then it's every couple of weeks or something like that. Okay. Last question. We'll get this thing wrapped up. We've been talking about the rut. We know that you're an early season guy. You like the early season. You like October, but in your rut hunting experience, how do you handle the lockdown phase specifically? And I know like there's always bucks searching for does, but at some point during the rut where you have peak breeding, like that peak conception date, majority wise, number wise, there's a lot of bucks with does. So how do you hunt the lockdown phase of the rut?
You get in all day and you really put in your time. Like, I mean, I don't think there's any secret to that, right? Like, I think what happens when we talk about the rut is we talk about all day sits and we talk about like really the grind and, like we want to sound as badass as possible. The truth is it's just time in the woods. And so you got to think about that. Okay. Like what if 60% of the bucks are locked down right now at any given moment? Well, 40% of them are out there running around, and so I don't feel that much difference when I'm hunting most of the spots I hunt from like a November 2nd sit versus a November like 15th sit, for example, or what, when they should be cruising, chasing versus when they should be locked down. Yeah. I'm never usually not like overrun with them anyway. So it's almost always just a matter of like, how many days can you put in on a funnel or a pinch point you really believe in and do that dark to dark stuff. And, if you believe in a spot and it's decent enough, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those days, somebody's coming through. As long as the conditions are working for you and the wind doesn't suck and you haven't burned it out. Like, I mean, there's obviously other variables, but it's like, sure, it's time and stand, man. And we talk a big game about it. A lot of people do, but it's tough. Really, it is really tough, but that's how you kill them. Like that's, if you want to have that buck cruise through there, just be there when he goes through.
You tend to gravitate more towards pinch points, and kind of travel or terrain features that are funneling movement during that time, or have you found yourself gravitating more towards like we'll call just deer bedding areas or doe bedding areas?
I'm all about pinch points and funnels.
Yep.
Yeah. I've done my rut strategy. Like if there's a certain situation where I know there's does bedded there and I can get downwind, I might do it, but I'm almost guaranteed to be on some kind of terrain feature anyway. I like finding where deer have to walk and sitting there, like it just works. It works all season long and it works really well during the rut.
Got it. Well, I think that's it, man. You're out of the hot seat. I think you passed with flying colors, even though the first one might've been a little soft. Gotta give you a hard time for not taking a hard stance, but, Tony, we greatly appreciate the time. I know you're a super busy guy, got a lot of stuff going on, and you were stuck on this damn meeting for 20 minutes or a half hour because I'm a dumbass and was in the wrong time zone. But anyways, greatly appreciate your time. If you want to direct all of our listeners to anything that you have going on, go ahead and take the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, everything's at MeatEater, themeateater.com, all my writing, Wired to Hunt, MeatEater.com/wires, where a lot of my deer stuff shows up. We've got the Wired to Hunt YouTube channel where we're putting up how-to stuff. I do the Foundations episodes every week for Mark, and you can find more than enough of me at MeatEater right now if you didn't get enough in this podcast. But man, this was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, folks, that's it. Until next time, we will talk to you soon.